The snow began before the vows were spoken. It drifted beyond the cathedral's towering stained-glass windows in pale, relentless sheets, soft as morning veils and just as merciless, swallowing the ancient streets of London beneath a silence that seemed almost reverent. Within, however, there was no silence at all. The great nave hummed with whispers, each one sharpened by scandal, passing from painted lips to gloved hands like poison poured carefully into crystal. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood at the altar beneath a crown of candlelight, her hands trembling only once before she forced them still. Her ivory satin gown had been tailored with exquisite precision, its lace sleeves descending like frost over her wrists, its train spilling behind her in folds fit for a queen. Yet no artistry of seamstress or jeweler could disguise the slight, unmistakable swell beneath her bodice. The child she carried had become the evening's most discussed guest. Around her, the assembled aristocracy watched with the gleaming avidity of spectators awaiting the final act of a tragedy. Ladies tilted their feathered fans just enough to conceal their smirks. Gentlemen bent their heads toward one another with murmurs of quiet amusement. Poor thing. How disgraceful. To think the Duke was forced into this. Eleanor heard every word, though none were spoken loudly enough to claim ownership. She kept her chin raised. If dignity could be fashioned into armor, hers was forged of tempered steel. At the opposite end of the altar stood Sebastian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshollow, broad-shouldered and immaculately severe in midnight formal wear. Candlelight carved hard planes across his face, but offered no warmth to his expression. His dark eyes remained fixed ahead, neither seeking Eleanor's nor avoiding them. He looked less like a bridegroom than a man attending his own sentencing. Once, nearly a year before, those same eyes had held something altogether different. She remembered a summer garden bright with roses, his gloved fingers brushing hers as he passed her a fallen bloom. She remembered moonlight across the terrace at Ashcombe Manor, and the rare, fleeting softness in his voice when he had said her name as though it carried meaning. That memory felt now like a cruel invention. The Archbishop's solemn intonations rolled through the cathedral. Vows were exchanged. Rings passed from trembling hand to unyielding finger. And then came the moment that would be remembered long after the wedding flowers had withered. When prompted to address his bride, Sebastian turned at last to face her fully. The room stilled. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, every syllable delivered with the polished restraint of a man long practiced in burying feeling. "You shall have my name, my title, and my protection, Lady Blackthorne." A pause followed, heavy enough to bend the air. "But never mistake duty for devotion." The words landed like the crack of winter ice. A collective intake of breath swept the cathedral. Somewhere among the pews, someone gave a soft gasp of delighted horror. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, though she did not flinch. To recoil would be to grant the audience its satisfaction. Instead, she inclined her head with such perfect grace that one might have mistaken his cruelty for courtesy. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied. Only those nearest enough to hear would have noticed the exquisite steadiness of her voice. The wedding breakfast that followed glittered with opulence and malice. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across silver platters untouched by appetite. Conversation flowed in smooth, poisonous currents around Eleanor as though she were both the occasion's centerpiece and its embarrassment. Sebastian scarcely spoke. He sat at the head of the table, remote as marble, acknowledging toasts with curt nods while his bride endured the scrutiny of every eye. When at last the final course was cleared, he rose. The scrape of his chair silenced the room. "Urgent affairs require my departure for the continent before dawn," he announced. Shock rippled through the gathering. To leave his bride on their wedding night was an insult so staggering it bordered on theatrical. Yet his expression betrayed nothing. He did not look at Eleanor as he offered his arm for the final procession. Outside, snow swirled thick as ash. The carriage awaiting her stood lacquered black against the whitening square, its crest already frosted over. Ravenshollow Castle lay far to the north, isolated among barren moors where winter lingered longest. She entered without protest. Hours passed beneath the mournful rhythm of wheels over frozen roads. At dawn, Ravenshollow emerged from the storm. It rose from the cliffs like something carved from the mountain itself, vast and austere, its towers vanishing into low clouds. No welcoming lanterns gleamed at its windows. No warmth softened its silhouette. It was not a home. It was an exile. The servants who received her were few and spectral in their silence, leading her through endless corridors where portraits watched from shadowed walls and the air smelled faintly of extinguished fires. When at last she was shown to her chamber, she dismissed her maid and stood alone before the hearth, staring into cold ashes. Slowly, she placed both hands over the child beneath her heart. "They may cast us into winter," she whispered, her voice trembling only now, "but you shall not be raised in coldness." A soft knock interrupted her vow. An elderly footman entered carrying a silver tray upon which rested a sealed envelope. "The Duke left this for your grace," he said. After he withdrew, Eleanor broke the black wax seal with unsteady fingers. Inside was a single sheet. "Do not expect my return before spring." Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. But as she lifted the page, something small slipped free and struck the floor with a sharp metallic sound. It was a silver key, delicate and old, gleaming faintly in the fireless room. And engraved upon its bow, in letters so worn they were nearly lost to time, was one word: "Forgive." Morning entered Ravenshollow reluctantly, as though even the pale winter sun hesitated to trespass upon a place so steeped in silence. Thin ribbons of light slipped through frost-laced windows and stretched across the stone floor of Eleanor's chamber, touching the silver key where it lay upon her bedside table like a question no one had thought to answer. She turned it over in her gloved palm as she stood at the window. Beyond the glass, the moor spread vast and white beneath a leaden sky, the world reduced to snow, stone, and distance. Somewhere beyond that frozen wilderness lay London with its chandeliers and laughter sharpened into ridicule. Somewhere farther still, across a cold and restless sea, was Sebastian Blackthorne. The thought of him no longer brought only hurt. Now it stirred confusion. Why send her here with that single cryptic word engraved upon the key? Why leave behind any token at all if indifference had truly been his intention? Questions, she had learned, could become prisons if allowed too much room to echo. By noon she had resolved to seek her answer. The West Tower had long stood abandoned, according to Mrs. Finch, Ravenshollow's severe but quietly loyal housekeeper. No servant entered it. No fires had warmed its hearth in nearly 20 years. When Eleanor presented the silver key, however, the older woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I had thought His Grace would never open that room again," she said. The tower staircase spiraled upward through cold gloom, each step sighing beneath Eleanor's careful tread. Dust silvered the banisters. Cobwebs trembled in corners like forgotten lace. Yet at the summit stood a walnut door untouched by decay, its brass lock gleaming faintly. The key turned with a smooth, decisive click. Inside, time had been preserved. The chamber beyond was small but intimate, paneled in dark oak and lined with shelves sagging beneath books. A faded Persian carpet softened the floor. Heavy curtains veiled tall windows, and upon a polished desk rested a scattering of charcoal sketches as though their owner had only just stepped away. Eleanor moved through the room slowly, reverently. She recognized at once the hand that had drawn the landscapes pinned neatly upon the walls. The lines were disciplined yet unexpectedly tender, capturing hills, trees, and rivers with startling sensitivity. Sebastian's hand. On a side table stood a toy wooden horse with one wheel broken cleanly away. Nearby lay a leather portfolio filled with youthful paintings, wild northern seas, storm-dark forests, and once, astonishingly, the delicate likeness of a woman seated beneath roses. His mother. The realization came with a quiet certainty. Beneath the portfolio she discovered a lacquered music box. Upon its lid was engraved in elegant script, "For the boy who feared being unloved." Her breath caught. This room was not merely a chamber. It was a wound preserved. The Duke the world knew, cold, remote, impenetrable, had once been a lonely child who drew pictures and kept broken toys. For several long moments she stood motionless, one hand resting over the life stirring within her. Then, with the clarity that grief sometimes grants, she understood. Whatever had frozen Sebastian Blackthorne had not begun with her. That afternoon she ordered the tower cleaned and its hearth lit. It was the first of many commands. Day by day Ravenshollow began to stir beneath her hand. Dust sheets vanished from neglected furniture. Fires awakened in forgotten grates. Curtains were thrown wide to admit the reluctant winter light. The kitchens, long dormant, filled once more with the fragrance of fresh bread and rosemary broth. The servants watched in astonished silence as their abandoned Duchess moved through the castle with serene purpose. Where Sebastian had left a mausoleum, Eleanor began building a home. Word spread swiftly through the surrounding village. First came Mrs. Whitcomb, recently widowed and desperate for employment. Eleanor installed her as nursery seamstress. Then came 2 orphan sisters driven from their cottage by fever. She gave them shelter in the East Wing. Before long, Ravenshallow's empty halls echoed with quiet industry, boots upon stone, laughter from distant corridors, the rustle of life returning where only stillness had endured. The villagers began calling her the Winter Duchess. Not with mockery but devotion. Yet while Ravenshollow warmed, scandal traveled southward like smoke. Letters arrived weekly from London, each bearing fresh reports of society's fascination. Some marveled at her transformation of the castle. Others speculated openly that Sebastian had abandoned her for good. Eleanor read them all without visible reaction. Still, on certain evenings she found herself standing in the West Tower, staring at those charcoal sketches and wondering whether their artist remembered how to feel. Then, late one snowy afternoon, another carriage climbed Ravenshollow's icy drive. Its crest bore the Blackthorne seal. 4 footmen unloaded an enormous crate wrapped in oilskin and bound with brass clasps. No letter accompanied it. Inside, Eleanor found an heirloom cradle of pale Italian walnut, carved with constellations and lined in ivory silk. Beside it lay matching nursery furnishings of exquisite craftsmanship, a rocking chair, a wardrobe painted with tiny silver stars, and a quilt embroidered by hand. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded its edge. In one corner, stitched so delicately it might have been missed, was a single word. Oh! She stared at it for a long time. This was no perfunctory duty. No careless gesture ordered by secretary or steward. Someone had chosen each detail with thought. Someone had remembered. That evening, as twilight bled violet across the snowbound grounds, a fresh newspaper arrived from London. Its headline screamed in bold black ink. Duke of Ravenshollow seen in Paris with the Marquise de Villette. The paper slipped from Eleanor's fingers. At that precise instant, a sharp pain seized her low and sudden, forcing her hand against the cradle for support. Another followed. And as wind rose howling against Ravenshollow's ancient walls, she understood with cold, terrible clarity that winter had not yet finished testing her. The storm descended upon Ravenshollow with the fury of something ancient and unforgiving. By nightfall, snow struck the castle windows in wild, frantic bursts, while the wind howled through the battlements like a choir of restless spirits. Every corridor trembled beneath the assault. Fires blazed in every hearth Eleanor had painstakingly restored, yet still the cold seemed to creep through the very stones, pressing inward as though winter itself had come to witness her trial. Another pain tore through her. She gripped the carved edge of the nursery cradle, her breath catching sharply as the room tilted around her. Mrs. Finch was at once beside her, steady and composed despite the concern tightening her lined face. "It is time, Your Grace." The words landed with terrible finality. Hours blurred into a haze of firelight and anguish. The birthing chamber glowed amber beneath dozens of candles, their flames guttering whenever the storm hurled itself against the panes. The physician had been summoned from the village before the roads vanished beneath drifts, and now moved with grave efficiency between whispered consultations and measured reassurances. Eleanor scarcely heard him. Pain consumed all language. She clutched the linen sheets until her knuckles blanched white, her dark hair damp against her temples, every breath ragged with effort. Between contractions her gaze drifted helplessly to the window where darkness pressed like an omen. Paris. The newspaper's cruel headline still burned in her thoughts. She had told herself she no longer expected tenderness from Sebastian Blackthorne. Yet the image of him in another woman's company had pierced more deeply than she wished to admit. It was not merely jealousy. It was the terrible humiliation of realizing that hope had taken root where she had meant only to endure. Another wave of pain struck, wrenching a cry from her lips. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm's roar, a distant thunder answered. At first she thought it was the sky. Then came another. And another. Hoofbeats. The chamber door burst open with such force that several candles shuddered. A figure strode in, cloaked in snow and shadow, his dark hair damp with melted frost, his face stark with urgency. Sebastian. For one suspended instant he stood motionless upon the threshold, his gaze finding Eleanor across the room. The composure that had once made him seem carved from winter itself was gone. What remained was naked fear. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides and dropped to his knees beside her bed, heedless of wet boots staining Persian carpet. Eleanor. Her name broke from him like prayer. She stared, too astonished even for anger. His gloved hand closed around hers, icy from the storm yet trembling. "If I am too late," he said, his voice rough with something dangerously close to panic, "I shall never forgive God nor myself." No polished restraint softened the confession. No ducal mask concealed it. For the first time since their wedding, she saw not the distant nobleman who had exiled her, but a man stripped bare by terror. The labor stretched through the long black hours. Sebastian did not leave. He remained at her side through every cry, every shuddering breath, every desperate grasp of her fingers against his. More than once the physician urged him to withdraw, but he refused with quiet steel. When Eleanor faltered, it was his voice that steadied her. "Look at me." She did. "You are stronger than this storm." And when she wept with exhaustion, his thumb brushed the tears from her cheek with a tenderness so instinctive it seemed to astonish even him. At last, as dawn's first gray light touched the horizon, the room filled with a new sound. A child's cry. Thin and fierce and wondrous. The world seemed to stop. The physician wrapped the infant swiftly and placed him in Eleanor's trembling arms. Their son. Tiny and solemn, with a shock of dark hair and tightly clenched fists as though already prepared to challenge fate itself. Eleanor gazed down at him through tears she no longer tried to conceal. When she lifted her eyes, Sebastian was watching them both with an expression she had never before seen upon his face. Wonder. Almost reverence. He reached out hesitantly as though afraid he had no right. At her small nod, he touched the child's cheek. His breath caught. "He has your mouth," he whispered. The fire burned low by evening, casting the chamber in intimate gold. Their son slept in the cradle beside the hearth while snow drifted softly beyond the windows, gentler now as though the storm had spent itself. Eleanor sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, pale but steady. Sebastian stood at the mantel, his broad shoulders rigid with unspoken thought. At last she broke the silence. "The Marquise de Villette." He turned sharply. Her gaze held his. "The papers said you were with her in Paris." Something dark and bitter flickered across his features. Of course they did. Were they lying? For a long moment he said nothing. Then he crossed to the fire and knelt before her chair, placing himself lower than her in a gesture of startling humility. "My father left Ravenshollow drowning in debt," he said quietly. "Debts so ruinous they would have stripped this title from our son before he drew his first breath. The Marquise brokered financial accords with the French ministry. I sought her assistance and nothing more." His jaw tightened. "I told no one because I feared if the negotiations failed, scandal would devour what little security remained." Eleanor studied him carefully. "And sending me here?" His eyes lowered. "This castle was the only place my father's cruelty never touched. My mother made it her refuge." His voice roughened. "I thought if I placed you here, you would be safe from the world I could not yet mend." He looked up then and all pretense fell away. "I left because every moment beside you made me wish for what I did not deserve." The confession struck with quiet force. Her breath caught. Slowly she reached toward him. But before her fingers could brush his cheek, urgent knocking shattered the stillness. A servant entered, pale-faced, carrying a sealed dispatch marked with the royal crest. Sebastian broke the wax. As he read, all warmth drained from his expression. When he lifted his eyes to hers, they held the terrible gravity of gathering storm. "I have been summoned to London," he said. His voice fell to scarcely more than a whisper. "They mean to challenge our son's legitimacy before Parliament." London greeted them beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. The city's grand facades loomed through drifting rain, all polished stone and iron severity, while carriage wheels hissed over slick cobbles as though the streets themselves whispered of scandal. From the moment the Blackthorne carriage crossed the square before Parliament, Eleanor could feel the eyes upon it. Curtains twitched behind townhouse windows. Gentlemen paused beneath umbrellas. Ladies leaned subtly from sheltered arcades, eager to glimpse the Duchess whose child had become the season's most ravenous entertainment. Inside the carriage, silence stretched taut between husband and wife. Their son slept in the nurse's arms opposite them, swaddled in cream wool and oblivious to the storm gathering around his name. Eleanor sat beside Sebastian, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her spine as straight as the cathedral columns beneath which she had once been humiliated. Yet this silence was not the same. At Ravenshollow, silence had been absence. Here it was anticipation. Sebastian's hand rested beside hers upon the velvet seat, close enough that she could feel its warmth through the narrow distance. Twice his fingers shifted, as though resisting the urge to bridge that final inch. Neither spoke. Words, she suspected, had become too frail for what waited ahead. The tribunal convened in Blackthorne Hall, the oldest chamber within Parliament's northern wing. Its vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows. Tall windows admitted a cold gray light that glinted off brass sconces and the polished oak benches where peers of the realm had gathered to judge. Every seat was filled. At the chamber's center stood Lord Augustus Blackthorne, Sebastian's cousin and nearest rival claimant to the title. Tall, elegantly silver-haired, and carrying himself with practiced righteousness, he looked every inch the statesman. Yet his pale eyes held the glittering satisfaction of a man who believed victory already his. When Eleanor entered upon Sebastian's arm, a murmur rippled through the hall. She wore no jewels beyond her wedding ring. Her gown was midnight blue, severe in its simplicity, and her expression was one of serene composure that made her seem carved from moonlight itself. She would not grant them spectacle. Lord Augustus rose first. His voice carried easily through the chamber, smooth and sharpened by false regret. It is with no pleasure that I question the succession of my own blood. Yet duty to the dignity of this house compels me to seek certainty. The haste of this marriage, the circumstances preceding it, and his Grace's conspicuous absence thereafter invite doubt no honorable man may ignore. The words fell precisely as intended. Measured, reasonable, poisonous. A rustle of agreement moved among several peers. Eleanor felt the old sting of humiliation threaten to surface, cold and immediate. She remembered cathedral whispers, lowered fans, Sebastian's devastating pronouncement. For one fleeting instant she wondered whether he would choose silence again. The Lord Chancellor turned toward the Duke. "Your Grace, how do you answer?" Sebastian rose. He did not glance toward Augustus. He did not address the chamber at once. Instead, before all assembled, he turned fully toward Eleanor. The movement alone shattered expectation. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand. His gloved fingers closed around hers with unmistakable firmness. The chamber fell still. When he spoke, his voice rang through the hall with a force no one present had ever heard from him. "This woman is not merely the mother of my heir." He lifted Eleanor's hand to his chest, where his heart beat hard beneath black wool. "She is the keeper of my soul." A collective breath caught. Augustus's composure faltered. Sebastian faced the tribunal then, his dark gaze sweeping across every witness. "You demand truth. Then hear it plainly." He removed his gloves and set them upon the bench as though casting aside the final symbol of aristocratic restraint. "Our son was conceived not through scandal, nor weakness, nor obligation. He was conceived in love I was too cowardly to name." The words struck the chamber like thunder. Shock widened noble eyes. Somewhere a woman gasped. Yet Sebastian continued, each sentence stripping him further of guarded pride. "My silence wounded my wife. My absence dishonored her. I believed distance would spare her the burdens of my inheritance and the shadows left by my father's cruelty. In that belief I became cruel myself." He turned again to Eleanor. There was no audience now in his expression. Only truth. "Lady Eleanor Blackthorne restored Ravenshollow from ruin while I hid behind duty and fear. She gave life to halls I had allowed grief to hollow. She gave our son his first home." His voice softened but lost none of its power. "She has shown more courage in one winter than I have shown in a lifetime." For a long moment no one spoke. Then the Lord Chancellor rose. "This tribunal requires no further testimony." The ruling came swiftly. The child's legitimacy was affirmed. Augustus's challenge collapsed beneath the weight of Sebastian's declaration. The chamber erupted into murmurs, but Eleanor heard only the rushing pulse in her ears. Sebastian had not merely defended their son. He had laid bare his heart before the entire realm. That evening, London lay washed clean by rain. Blackthorne House glowed with candlelight, its vast ballroom emptied of guests and musicians alike. Hundreds of tapers shimmered against mirrored walls, casting golden reflections that multiplied into infinity. Sebastian stood waiting at the center of the polished floor. No title cloaked him now. No reserve. Only a man holding out his hand to the woman he had once failed. "This dance was owed to you," he said quietly. Eleanor regarded him for a long moment. Then she placed her hand in his. As they moved into the slow, elegant measure of a waltz, the years of restraint between them seemed to dissolve into the candlelit hush. His hand at her waist was steady. His gaze never left hers. "You have given me much to forgive," she murmured. "I know. And yet forgiveness is not freely won. It shall be earned." There was no hesitation in his answer. She studied the solemn sincerity etched across his features, and something long frozen within her began at last to thaw. When the music faded into silence, she reached for his hand and guided it gently to rest against the soft curve of her abdomen. At first he frowned in confusion. Then understanding dawned. His breath stopped. Her lips trembled into the faintest smile. "There is one truth yet withheld, Your Grace," she whispered. As wonder transformed his face, a sharp knock sounded at the ballroom doors, and the butler entered pale with urgency. "Your Grace," he said, voice strained, "there is a fire at Ravenshollow. Yet one chamber remains sealed." The silver key had never left Eleanor's keeping. She had worn it upon a ribbon beneath her gown since the day she first found it. On the evening of Ravenshollow's reopening, the entire village gathered in the great hall. Candles blazed from every candelabrum. Music filled the air. Laughter rose beneath vaulted ceilings that had once known only silence. Their son slept peacefully upstairs. And Eleanor, now carrying their second child beneath her heart, stood at the foot of the grand staircase while Sebastian crossed toward her through the golden light. He wore no ducal regalia. Only a simple black coat, severe in its elegance. When he stopped before her, he dropped to one knee. The room fell silent. From his pocket he withdrew the matching half of the silver key she had carried all winter. A murmur swept through the hall. There was always a second key, he said, his dark eyes never leaving hers. My mother divided them before her death. One for the door. One for the heart that might someday be worthy to open it. He rose and offered his hand. Together they climbed the eastern staircase toward the sealed chamber. Before assembled servants and villagers, they turned their keys in tandem. The lock gave way. The doors opened. Sunlight poured through tall arched windows into a vast circular library lined floor to ceiling with books. Fresh roses bloomed upon every sill. At its center stood an easel, a cradle, and above the mantel, carved into white marble, the words, "For the woman who taught stone to breathe." Eleanor's breath caught. Slowly she turned. Sebastian stood behind her, emotion bare upon his face. Once he had been a man who offered titles in place of tenderness. Now his voice trembled with unguarded truth. "I gave you this castle to keep you distant," he said. "Tonight I offer you my life, my failures, my hopes, and every remaining year within them. If there is mercy in your heart still, claim them." Tears blurred her vision. Yet she smiled. She stepped forward, placed both hands against his face, and kissed him before all gathered below. The great hall erupted in joyous applause, but Eleanor heard only the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. Beyond the windows, spring wind moved softly through Ravenshallow's blooming gardens. And as twilight settled over the castle that had once stood frozen and forsaken, warm light spilled from every chamber, carrying laughter into the dark. A quiet, radiant proof that even the coldest walls may yield when love is brave enough to remain until they learn at last how to breathe.